Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. Thanks to Vikram. BIC has been a very interesting and supportive place for authors such as myself. And I really appreciate the fact that, they're open to a wide range of ideas and a wide range of books. And this platform is, I think, an integral component of the Bangalorean spirit. So glad to be here. I'd like to be brief, but I'll start off with two sort of questions that triggered me into my research. So the first question is, what is really the indigenous Bharatiya model of, or the Bharatiya economic model? This was something that, as Bharat becomes a superpower, or in the path of becoming a superpower, one of the things that's likely to happen in the next 10, 15 years is the question, Bharat's ideas will take mainstream, in the sense, what defines us? What are the ideas that we have brought to the table? So obviously the economic ideas of Bharat will also become mainstream, because without economics, you don't really find, because economics takes center stage much more than other sort of streams and professions, purely by the nature of the subject. So when I was dealing with this question, I obviously looked at the past and I tried to make some sense of if there is any literature available on defining this economic model. Because often the answer that I was given was, Swadeshi was the answer to this question. In my view, that really isn't an answer, because Swadeshi was a political movement, which is in response to the freedom movement. But if you really look at, say, thousands of years of our history, what I noticed is that, Bharat and China were the most dominant countries in terms of GDP and GDP per capita over a period of, say, 1,500 years. Angus Madison, a lot of people would have heard of him, was a world-renowned historian. He had done some work. Besides Madison's work, there's also a lot of anecdotal and secondary evidence which showcases this prosperity. And that includes, of course, in the introduction we mentioned about the Brihadisvara temple and the Angkor Wat. These are all not just sort of religious institutions, but they are engineering marvels which are even difficult to sort of even replicate even today. So did these things just happen out of thin air, or there was some thinking behind it, some level of thought process behind it? So that's when I chanced upon the Arthashastra, which is a 3rd century BCE text, for those who are not aware, written by Kautilya, Chanakya. And the text is meant to be a sort of a template, a set of ideas for economic governance during Kautilya's, around the 3rd century BCE. It also reflects a set of, it doesn't prescribe any sort of model per se, but it gives you a set of ideas based on the idea of Dharma. And that's when I bring about this concept called Dharmic Capitalism. Dharma is a very sort of multidimensional word, but for the narrow sort of definition of economic policy, I define it through ethics, responsibilities, and institutions, and harmony. Ethics, in terms of clean institutions, clean administration, clean leadership, and harmony in terms of engaging with the rest of the world, wealth creation with the rest of the world, and then responsibilities in terms of familial, societal, and environmental responsibilities. So all of this maps to a structure which talks about a state that is strong but doesn't micromanage, wealth creation by engaging the rest of the world in terms of trade, in terms of commerce. Often we are told that we somehow became open only after the liberalization reforms of 1990. But the reality is we have been an open society engaging the rest of the world for thousands of years. And that sort of spirit of wealth creation while engaging with the world is another important component of this. And then the entire idea of sustainability. We talk about climate change, we talk about the issues related to climate change. All these were all sort of central to what Kautilya was prescribing. So my first book sort of deals with all this and then contextualize it to today's economic structure. So in Dharmanomics, what I try to do is to showcase a continuity of this. In my research, when I look at the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Vijayanagara Empire, Cambodia, which I call Kambuja Desa, which was called Kambuja Desa, Champa, which is Vietnam today, and then Java and a wide range of Southeast Asian kingdoms, you see that between the early CE period, especially between 5th or 6th century CE till almost 13th, 14th century CE, a lot of these kingdoms had Dharma-based economic frameworks. So when I mean Dharma-based economic frameworks, what I mean is foundationally Dharma was an important component of their economic governance. So in this book, I try to showcase this through like 3 buckets. One is the Dharmic Capitalism, which I mentioned of Kautilya. Another is what I call the Dharmic ecosystem, which is basically the temple-based economies. If you go to Cambodia, if you travel in Cambodia, you would notice that there would be shivlings and temples in villages which are just there. They're all non-functional temples now, but they were sort of integral to their governance and to their structure of the economy, in early CE. So you see this in a lot of these Southeast Asian kingdoms. So the temple, I try to view this not just as a sort of a religious institution, which is of course important and it has its own role, and also as an economic institution. How the temple-based economies creates an ecosystem around the temple, which creates an economic factor of multiplication for a lot of these societies. So the second part of it is this Dharmic ecosystem, which I mentioned. And the third is what I call the Sreni Dharma. The Srenis were like corporate guilds of those times. These corporate guilds played a very important role in maritime trade. For example, there was a corporate guild which is called Ainurvar. In Tamil, it's called 500. In fact, it was started in Karnataka by a group of folks in Karnataka. And it's a huge guild, which is basically you can call a guild a sort of a multinational corporation in today's times. They had offices in various parts of Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Cambodia, in Vietnam. And in fact, when Rajendra Chola, that is Rajaraja Chola's son, Rajaraja Chola built the Brihadisvara temple, his son Rajendra Chola, he was the one who traversed and conquered, went over to Southeast Asia and conquered. One of the major reasons that triggered his conquest was that this particular guild, which played a very important role in financing the Cholas, they were trading towards China. So if you want to trade towards China, even today, you have to go via the Straits of Malacca and via Singapore. And these guilds were, sort of not given access, or they were sort of prevented from trading by the Srivijaya kingdom, which used to rule Indonesia. So the Cholas had to confront this, and this was one of the reasons why Rajendra Chola had to go and conquer this place, so that sort of liberate the guilds and so that they can sort of trade with the rest of Asia and go to China and trade as well. So what I'm trying to say is the importance of commerce was there in even the political dynamics of a lot of these kingdoms, and the guilds played a very important role. And these Srenis were also governed by a system based on the idea of Dharma. So, for example, since I mentioned they're a corporation, so they had elections to nominate members of this corporation. They were very egalitarian. They had people across caste, across creed. And they also had people who are from different countries as well. For example, some Jews were part of some of these corporate guilds because they were also engaging in commerce. So this is another sort of component which I deal with in the book. And this goes across these kingdoms, and I've traveled to many of these places. I went to Cambodia, I've been to a lot of these places to understand more about the inscriptions, because one of the important things that one needs to do, especially when dealing with economic history, is what I call triangulation of evidence. Because data per se is a bit scarce, because we're talking about thousands of years back. So the veracity of data is a bit of an issue. But we do have data. So data is one component of the analysis. Another component is what I call secondary research, which means this is sort of inscriptions, analyzing the inscriptions, decoding these inscriptions, and forming a narrative based on the inscriptions, a thematic narrative based on the inscriptions. And third is what I call anecdotal evidence, right? Which means you have a lot of these travelers and travelogues of people who have traveled in Bharat during that time. For example, there are Chinese embassy notes, which the Cholas had while when they had sent missionaries to the Chinese to China to engage with them. So these embassy notes provide us good form of evidence. You have Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is again a travelogue by a person who traveled to these places for trade. And then you have Greek traveler accounts and a variety of these anecdotal evidence. So sort of these three forms of evidence need to be sort of triangulated for us to form a thematic impression. And that's how a lot of my research and the data and the analysis that comes in these books that's how I bring about the analysis. So the last, I mean, the obvious question is, how does all this relate today to us, right? Because we are living in 2024 and we want to know, how does this relate to us? And I think this leads to my second research question, because when I started this talk, I mentioned that I had two research questions. One was on the indigenous model. Second is the role of culture, norms, and narratives in economic decision making. So if you really look at our sort of consumption patterns, like how do we spend? How do common people spend? If you really look at the data, much of our discretionary spending, we have discretionary and non-discretionary spending. Right? Non-discretionary is essential spending. Like you have to go for a medical checkup, or you have to pay rent, or your basic things that you spend on. And then discretionary spending, where you have a choice. Most of our discretionary spending is aligned to a lot of the cultural activities that we have throughout the year. Whether it is, for example, the highest number of UPI transactions in this calendar year was during the week of Diwali, compared to any other week during the entire year. So much of our discretionary spending, especially in Bharat, is linked intrinsically to the cultural prism of Bharat. When I mean cultural prism, it includes festivals, it includes occasions, it includes a variety of things. But a lot of these things determine our choices. So the way of life that we talk about is not something that just originated today. It's a consequence of centuries of it's a consequence of many decades of existence and experience. And I think understanding this way of life is very important for us to, and understanding how these choices are made is very important for us to formulate economic policy. Because only when you get a better understanding of these choices, people or policymakers can tweak policy to make it more effective. And this is just not at the individual level, right? If you take at the corporate level, let's take the top 10, 15 businesses in this country, right? Most of them, if not all of them, are all family-owned businesses in some form or the other. They might be publicly listed, but they're all governed by a central family that runs most of these businesses. And family-owned businesses make economic choices not completely on rationality. They make economic choices based on a wide range of factors, of which their cultural, societal norms play a very important role in their decision-making. So even at the corporate level, I think there is a very strong case for cultural norms and narratives and their role in economic decision-making and business decision-making. And I think that needs to be studied more. And this is studied across the world. I mean, if you look at, there are Nobel laureates in the US who have studied a lot of these things. For example, Gary Becker, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, one of his earlier works in the US was on the role of discrimination and culture in the United States. Gary Eckleroff, who won George Eckleroff, who won the Nobel in 2001 for asymmetric information, his stream of research talks a lot about identity economics, the role of, again, identities, role of norms, cultural norms in decision making. And similarly, Abner Grieve has done some work from Stanford. So what I'm trying to say is, a lot of Western researchers have talked a lot about this in their own countries and contributed to the discussion. But unfortunately, where it's central in Bharat, both in the informal sector and in the formal sector in terms of both at the corporate and the individual level, well, cultural norms and narratives play a central role in economic decision making. But there's barely any research in this country. So I think the idea of this research is to answer these two, big questions, and then draw and provide a qualitative framework through the Dharma-based economic frameworks to argue that this way of life is defined through, centuries of experience, not just the spiritual realm, but also at an economic, practical, sort of, commercial realm as well. And we need to sort of understand this and debate and discuss this more. And that's where that's where my interest in this led me to these books. And my third book, which is coming out in probably a year and a half, deals with how some of these things, some of these ideas will percolate, could be used for the current context to ensure more effective policy implementation. I think that's something we'll probably further discuss with Vikram, and with this, I will sort of just wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to BIC. I suppose a couple of norms for our discussion today. The teacher in me can never be too far away. So as we're having this discussion, I intended it to be an open participative one. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please don't wait till the end. Just raise your hand and the mic will come to you. So let's make it topical and not structural, I suppose. Let me just start with, first of all, thank you for being here today. Let me start with a few operating definitions so that we're all on the same page. And a lot of the thinking around whether it's economics or ways of life in the Indic tradition get caught up in the sort of the norms, the words and the vocabulary of it, but the deeper meaning gets missed. So you basically have three really core ideas. One is the idea of Dharmanomics. The second is the Sreni, the Srenis, and the third is your KDC, right? Like the main model. So each one of these, but also like the idea of Dharma itself. Can you just kind of give us an operating definition so we're all on the same page? Yeah, it's on. It's on.
Hello.
It should be on. Just
is it okay? It's okay.
No, I think you switched it off. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, like I mentioned, right? I mean, let's start with Dharma itself. I think we can write multiple books on defining Dharma, right? So, I'm not going to be, sacrosanct here to talk, give a lecture on Dharma, because I don't neither have the, I would say the intellectual depth nor the anubhava or the experience to debate on that topic. But having said that, through the narrow prism of economic policy, because Dharma is a very multidimensional word. So in the book, for example, I give examples of things like Saucham, cleanliness, various definitions of Dharma for the curious. But for the prism of purely economic construct, like I mentioned, I define it through three pillars. One is through ethics. Basically ethics through the prism of a clean administration, clean leadership, again referring to the state, and also a business environment which is corruption free and clean. And then I look at this another bucket of harmony. Harmony is just not just communal harmony, but sort of harmony with engaging with the rest of the world. Because if you notice one thing throughout our history, I'm talking about even Saraswati Sindhu civilization onwards or even prior, you could find that we have continuously engaged with the rest of the world, right? For example, the highest deposit of Roman coins besides Europe is found in southern India in around 1 century CE, right? Highest deposit of Roman coins, which are basically the barometer for Europe to trade with. And so what I'm trying to say is a large, irrespective of who ruled these places, it could be, the Cholas, it could be Pallavas, it could be any kingdom. Most of them had a base, Generally, right, when you have a political sort of entity, that political dispensation sort of rules, tries to, get their ideas to the people, right? In this particular case, what you notice is that this is something that you find across board. And these guys are fighting with each other every other, year for whatever, small wars, big wars, whatever you can call it. But this undercurrent of engaging with the rest of the world was there as part of their sort of lifestyle and ecosystem. So the second part of it is through what I define is harmony. And third part, very important, is on responsibilities. Because much of the Anglo-Saxon narrative is all about, rights, and the role of rights and what rights have to do with everything, right? I'm not saying that, Kautilya or our thinkers did not think about rights. They saw rights as an important component, but they saw responsibilities as a bigger, focus. Because responsibilities works in a form of an autopilot, right? So if there's a societal moral obligation to society for whatever reason, you don't need the state to come and tell you to do this, right? Because there's a moral obligation, say, between me and you. Say, for example, you're my brother, for example, right? And then there is a moral obligation for me to take care of yourself, right? I don't need the state to come and tell you that this guy needs to be taken care of, right? So what I'm trying to say is, so Kautilya argues, or the idea of Dharma, through which Kautilya argues, is the role of responsibilities not just at the societal level, not at the familial level, and even at the environmental level. The broader, focus on environment. Because one of the definitions of Dharma is again Saucham, which is cleanliness, for example, right? So intrinsically, the need to protect the environment, the need to protect social, structures is an inbuilt concept, through the definition of Dharma. So this is how I have sort of defined it in the previous book as well as I extend it here. Yeah. Of course, I could be, there could be other versions of, definitions of Dharma, and there could be books written on it. But purely in this type of an exercise, you want to, make it a bit more focused, and you want to make it a bit more, so that the common people can sort of absorb what you're trying to say. So in that attempt, I've sort of, narrowed it down to that prism.
Yeah. Thank you. I think just to reiterate, it's very easy to go in circles when we talk about ideas like these. So just from the book, there is ethics, there's harmony, and there's responsibilities, which form the core of this book's notion of Dharma and how then it flows into economics. This is an article which was reviewing your previous book, which talks about this idea, which lesser known fact, that Adam Smith, before Wealth of Nations, he was a moral philosopher. And he had published a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which, from what I'm hearing from you, it almost seems like it's a moral imperative, right? Like the idea of Dharma, and particularly as you mentioned it, relating to responsibilities. Right. My question though is, it's sort of like the how of it, right? Like in the sense, how do we make sure that this actually plays out? Everyone knows what the right thing to do is. How does one make sure that it's happening without danda, right? Like without punishment or disincentivizing it. So thoughts on that?
Right. So an extension of this is also the role that Dharma can play in the modern structure, right? So in the modern macroeconomy, we have the state as an entity, and then we have the market as an entity, right? So the state is basically, what does the state do? I mean, if there's an economic, say, crisis, the government, either reduces taxes, stimulates the economy, or pumps in money in terms of infrastructure, like Gati Shakti, for example, so that you stimulate economic activity, right? So the state plays an important role in stimulating the economic balance, right? On the other hand, you have the market, right? You have the market players who are, competing in the market. You have economies of scale, you compete in the marketplace, and then you expand your business, and then, the economic churn, aggregates and does that. Kautilya's argument is that the role of Dharma is a foundation to this binary. He looks beyond this binary of the state and the market, right? Imagine you have a variable which is beyond the state and the market, and can influence both of the state and the market. So, for example, so Dharma serves as a foundation. Let me give you a practical example, right? So, say there is corruption in the state, right? Yeah. There is corruption in bureaucracy and in some, parts of the administration, right? So, Kautilya's argument is that if it's a more dharmic society, the propensity for that individual to be corrupt or in the state becomes lesser, okay? It doesn't extinguish it, but it at least provides a moral sort of fabric for that individual at the state to be less corrupt. Similarly, at the market, most of you would have heard of something called moral hazard, right? Moral hazard is basically if there's a big firm and there's a small firm competing in a particular marketplace, then the big firm has an undue advantage because it's a big firm, it controls a lot of factors. You ideally want to have a platform which is fair, which provides free competition, so that both of them can compete in the same marketplace. So to avoid moral hazard, Kautilya again advocates for a more dharmic approach to business. And he argues that through this approach, you sort of create a much more fairer and equitable environment. So what I'm trying to say is the stresses that you have in the state and the market can be sort of leveraged by this idea of dharma as a foundation. So that's how a lot of our thinkers in the past have envisaged this, because they see this as a way of life what people are living. So when you communicate in that language to them, it resonates far more with them from their past experience into these practical norms.
But I'm going to push a little more here. I still don't hear the how. I feel like the only way it seems to play out, especially in a country like ours where we don't need to discuss corruption, what in short of punishment or some kind of consequence, what do you advocate as a concept of Dharmanomics to create this? For people to be more moral.
Okay, so you're talking about the current context, right?
Yeah.
So I've shared a lot of these things in my upcoming book, but having said that, I will try to throw some ideas, right? Yeah. So one is this concept of dharmic nudges, that the entire nudge theory. I think your audience would be aware, where you basically have a public policy situation. Say, for example, tax compliance, right? How many people pay taxes, right? Yeah. So one of the things, say, in a nudge theory, is you sort of put them into the tax bracket by default, and if for some reason they don't need to pay taxes, they withdraw the taxation from it. So that way your amount of compliance is far higher than lesser. So similarly, in policy initiatives, there can be various nudges that can be done to sort of expand policy, right? So let's take the Swachh Bharat initiative, which we all are aware about. Why is it that the Swachh Bharat initiative is far more effective in rural areas compared to, say, urban areas like Bangalore, right? I think there is a reason, because most of, when you go to, in all our neighborhoods and all our houses, we're all very clean. We have a natural propensity to be clean. The idea of Saucham, which I mentioned. But somehow we don't translate it to the neighborhoods. So in the Swachh Bharat initiative, once they set up a lot of these Swachhata, clinics in all these rural areas, they made a very conscious attempt to appeal to the people on the Saucham aspect of why it is important from a dharmic lens for them to be clean, and the need for them to bring it to their society, to the neighborhood outside. And through the scheme, the massive popularity of the Prime Minister and the huge scheme that was advocated, it has had a profound effect. I mean, for example, I'm just back from a very rural village in Tamil Nadu, where, it has made a transformative effect where people are naturally doing this because they feel a natural need. They see it's their way of life to do this. And they have brought it to their neighborhood. They see a conscious attempt to do this. So this is an example of compliance of a public policy which can be improved if you understand the way of life far better, in my view. No. Similarly, I'll give you another example, right? So, in fact, I mentioned this the previous time I was here. The sovereign gold scheme that the RBI floated. The RBI basically has a gold scheme where people can deposit their gold to the bank in a particular bond, and then after maturity of the bond, you get back a new tranche of gold, and whatever excess maturity that you get out of it, right? When they initially floated the scheme became had a lot of issues. So they did a survey among all the participants. The single biggest reason why the scheme wasn't successful was when Indian women wanted to give their gold, they wanted the same gold back after 3 years. The same gold back after 3 years, irrespective of the overall value. So what they were saying is, you give me back the same gold, the rest of it you give me in new tranche of gold, you give me in cash, I don't care, right? I want the same gold back, right? This is a very, very important idea. Gold is just not about productivity. It's a sentimental asset in this country. because it's come through many generations. Women who are the central of the household of most families in this country make choices which are based on ideas that we are talking about. So what the RBI did was they after a couple of iterations, they brought about the possibility of doing this as well, where they could give you back the same gold through some other form. So the effectiveness of policy is increased. Imagine if you are a policy maker, you have a profound understanding of this, and then you execute policy in a way which is aligned to this. It makes your effectiveness far higher, right? So these are some of the practical ways in which some of these things can be implemented. But for that, there are two things need to be done. One, you need to acknowledge the fact that such a way of life exists in this country without any pretense of existing otherwise. Two, one of my attempts is to establish a qualitative framework based on the idea of Dharma, which is the sort of root of this way of life that we're talking about today. And once you come to that understanding and acknowledgement, then we look at analyzing this and seeing how this way of life and attuning policy to that way of life can make policy making far more effective. Because eventually you want, in our, quest for Viksit Bharat, you have to have a buy-in of the people in the process, right? Not just urban, educated, anglicized elite, right? Probably BIC needs that buy-in. But if you really want to have the real Bharat, you need a buy-in of large sections of people. And as we move towards Viksit Bharat, remember there are two huge segments that need to make this transformation. One is the informal sector. The informal sector contributes almost 75-80% of employment in this country, even today. It contributes 30 to 40% of GDP. In an informal sector, your kirana shops that you see everywhere, most of their financing is done within the familial system, the cultural domain of the system. For example, if a small kirana shop goes bust, the familial system contributes financing to ensure that sustainability of that kirana shop first. And then after all these things doesn't work, he or she goes to the bank. So what I'm trying to say is there's a huge informal sector that needs to make this transformation. And this huge informal sector works on cultural norms and narratives, things like trust, things like community. These are central to their ecosystem, whether you like it or not. So, how do you deal with this and how do you ensure this transformation happens in a sustainable and very, effortless manner is also understanding this whole informal sector. And the second part of it is not just the informal sector, even within the formal domain, right? Corporate India is formal domain. But still your top 15, 20 businesses are all driven by family-owned enterprises, or at least the top 10 businesses.
And the norms and narratives come back there.
So, if for corporates to make decisions, major decisions, if you don't understand the psyche in which they're functioning, then I think there is an issue with policy, because you have to come to terms with this understanding. So that's where I see some of the practical.
So I'm going to go to the second part of the operating definition, which is capitalism. Yeah, Vanita.
Yeah, since you said to interrupt at an appropriate time, I'm doing that right now. I work on the informal sector, and what you're saying is music to my ears. However, the idea of informality in India is more like a jugaad system. Even in India, we call it jugaad, very unfortunately. It's actually an operating system. But it's not being recognized as an operating system because the direction is towards formality driven by a Western framework. How do you think we can create some kind of a hybrid, even if it isn't fully informal, which is, of course, we probably don't want one. How do we create a hybrid? And how do we bring the world to understand that this hybridization is perfectly normal?
Very valid question. That is precisely the point, man. Because this narrative, formality is important, yes. But what is formality, right? For example, if most of the informal firms today are all digitized, right? Is being digital formal? If that's the case, we are already mostly formal, right? Formality and this, this sort of obsession with the Western definition of formality, I think we need to move beyond that. Because eventually, like what she mentioned, this hybrid norm is going to be the norm for a lot of people. Because there would be a lot of these firms who would want to be in their own structures that we're talking about, right? As long as you have a set of first principles, right? Corporate principles, you can call them, say transparency, proper taxation, say, for example, governance structures,
Labor
protection, right? If you're going to have a sort of first principles which are already sort of taken care by the informal structure, then I think we need to, come to terms with the fact that that's how they're going to be, right? Beyond which, pushing them into completely formal structure as defined by the Western norms is going to be counterproductive. Because most of these firms are all, either hundreds of years old or multiple generation based firms. So I would say this hybrid structure is an important contribution. And then how do we take others on board? I think work such as this sort of help to push in that direction. Because you need credible research to showcase these ideas, not just for us, but for the rest of the world, to showcase that this is how our ecosystem is. For example, if you look at the Japanese have a very, very conservative society, far more conservative than us. And most of their things are all driven, most of the language is completely Japanese in communication everywhere. And most of their sort of corporate and economic values and thinking are all driven by Japanese cultural norms. In fact, the Japanese Ministry of Finance has a subdivision on on economic history, which plays an important role in elucidating policy. So what I'm trying to say is on positioning to the rest of the world, I think credible, authentic research without a political sort of bias, and engagement on these ideas in wider platforms. But I think this will gain credence, right? So that's where we are at a very important inflection point. This conversation that we are having, if I had it 10 years back, or 15 years back, or 20 years back, it would have not been a relevant conversation. But today, this conversation becomes relevant because in another 10, 15 years, when you are sort of third largest country in the world, and you become, en route to say $10 trillion economy, your ideas and your principles and norms take center stage because you're an example of a successful up and coming superpower. That context is very different to 20, 25 years back, right? So that makes a lot of the buy-in that we are seeking far more easier compared to before. So
Thanks. Did you have a question? Yeah. Sreni.
If I can, and I'd like to posit a topic for you to consider as you answer the next set of questions. The notion of formalism takes us back to the 70s where we saw everybody who's not formal as being a price gouger or a profiteer. So that's why we negotiated everything, even with the smallest kirana, if you remember. If you take that same notion and progress it further, you also have examples of, the Tamil Nadu mercantile economy, which funded the British, which eventually used that same money to conquer us, if you may. How does Dharmic economics protect against it or maybe deal with it?
right. So I would again go back to the first principles, right? What we are doing, what we are sort of used to is we have these notions of theories which a bunch of people, let's take the post-independent phase, right? And if you really look at the post-independent phase, much of the thinking, right, used to come from Delhi, right? And when I mean from Delhi, it's a bunch of people in Lutyens Delhi, most of them well-intentioned, especially in the economic policy space, but most of them are part of the same elite that we're talking about, right? So I'll give you an example. So I have a co-author of mine who's a very prominent economist, a very good friend of mine. So he was telling me about his PhD that he did in the 1970s in an Ivy League institute, okay? So I was telling him, look, you're talking about a PhD in an Ivy League institute in the 1970s, right? My grandmother was trying to find the next source of food for the next day during the time you were doing your PhD in Ivy League University, okay? That is the difference between the Bharat that was there and the India of the elite, right? So you had a situation where in the 70s, 60s, 70s, most of them are Western educated. Most of them well-intentioned, yes, but they come with a particular background. And that background is not necessarily aligned to the rest of Bharat, right? So you had a lot of policies which were sort of replications of what the West was into a Bharatiya model, right? As we are growing more and more, we are seeing that more and more of this is becoming irrelevant, right? More and more of this is sort of anathemical to how we are living and the issues and challenges that we are facing, right? So what I'm trying to say is the strictures that come through these, I think we need to move from that and move on first principles, on the role of principles. If you're looking at the Dharmic principles that I mentioned as a base for any form of iterative policy, okay, any localized entity can have an iterative policy. But as long as these first principles are followed, then it's a principles-based approach rather than a structure-based approach. Then you inherently provide flexibility, right? So this also leads to another issue that across India, across Bharat, there are various micro clusters and various dimensions to these micro clusters. So any sort of stricture or any sort of particular way of economic governance is going to at some point backfire. So instead of strictures, I think it's important to look at a principles-based approach. And that way, not only will you get a buy-in from the local community, you will also have the flexibility to have local models. So I'll finish up with this. So there's this brilliant book on how China escaped poverty. The author's name is not coming to my head, but I read it recently. So it talks about how the Chinese actually overcame, tried to eliminate poverty at such large scale in the last 30-35 years. If you really look at the way they did it, a lot of it is through this flexibility in decentralized thinking, right? Unlike the West, because though China is not democratic, I think because of the population and the complexity population provides, it gives us a segue into some of these ideas and how this inherent flexibility is important. And that's what you see, for example, with the Prime Minister. One quality that I really, that one needs to understand is he's probably the only Prime Minister after Lal Bahadur Shastri who's experienced poverty. No other Prime Minister, post-independence, has experienced poverty as much as this current Prime Minister. So he understands the way of life, not probably through an economic, obviously through, he would understand the economics of it, but from a social lens. So he has, for example, the potential to see the importance of, say, an Ujjwal Yojana, importance of a light in a house, a roof in a house, right? So what I'm trying to say is this ability to sort of understand local conditions, local norms, work through these principles, I think could be a better, more agile approach.
Coming back, can we hold for a second? I'll come back. I do intend to speak a little also. Just coming to capitalism, right? This is a great paper that I found on 5 models of capitalism. So, the definition goes something like this. Capitalism is not a mere abstraction, a market economy, but rather a historically situated economic system, which is always evolving, always reflecting technological change and the political struggles through which ideologies and institutions are expressed. And it goes on further to say there are 5 forms of capitalism, more or less. The first is the sort of in the rich countries, there are 3, which is the liberal democratic Anglo-Saxon model, or the social European model, or you have the social integration-based Japanese model. Then in the developing world, you have the Asian developmental model, which is China and some of the other Asian tigers. And then you have the liberal dependent model that is probably Brazil. So these are your 5 models. And, I'm quoting from your book now, which is essentially this idea that, you map everything to broad themes of a rule-based yet non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook and in sustainable growth and welfare. These themes are based on clean administration, clean institutions, enforcement of rules, drivers of economic growth, having a global outlook, social welfare and well-being. So all sounds similar in a sense. So when we talk about Dharmanomics, is it just old wine in a new bottle, or what really differentiates it from what we're trying to understand?
Yeah, I think it's a completely new wine because, see, a lot of these models that you're talking about, right? They're all driven by the binary of the state and the market. There is the external entity of a lifestyle driven approach, right? The closest is probably the Japanese model.
I was going
right?
to say, yeah.
Because the Japanese talk about societal integration,
Yeah.
right? But what I'm trying to say is that the inherent motivation for an individual while making an economic choice is just not a rational choice. Okay? The assumption of a lot of these models is that it's essentially a rational choice. I think even in the West, people have moved away from this narrative, where people realize that this prism of rationality has its own constraints, and there is a multi-dimensional approach to this, to these choices. In this particular construct, we are talking about, I'm not trying to sort of make us somehow unique species. I'm not trying to come to that space. What I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to, articulate is that there is this way of life which is inherently solving some of these issues that we're talking about, right? Not because the state or not because we are talking about it. It's because their thousands of years of experience have made them do this in this space, in this time, right? So this is a natural cause of action which is happening, right? And that cause of action, at least for in our land, I think, makes an important, contribution to how we want to progress. I'm saying, put it this way, right? I don't think this Dharmic model could be applicable for all the countries, right? I think for the sort of Bharatiya, structure and lifestyle, I think it's an important component, right? Of course, there are various iterations. Some of these components of it as individual components can be used in a variety of other spaces, right? But again, see, even if ethics, right? Ethics itself, when I translate it to English, it has its own shortcoming, right? Whereas when I say it is a dharmic thing to do, there's a multidimensional nature to it, right? English is a language because of its shortcoming cannot communicate this multidimensionality, right? But any person on a common person on the street, irrespective of his education, could sort of relate to this. So that's the essence I'm talking about, right? I'm not saying that this is a universal sort of approach to capitalistic, as an alternative to capitalism. In the Indian context, it's definitely, I would say, an integral sort of part of the Indian context, right? From a sort of Western, how other countries can sort of approach this would be through the prisms that are there in some of these ideas in their own, countries. But the point really is, much of this one-size-fit-all model, which was in the 60s, 70s sort of advocated as some gospel prism, even the West has moved away from it after the 2008 crisis. I mean, most of the, multilateral institutions or even all the Western sort of, models talk about, a customized sort of a much more holistic approach. Whether we have moved from it or not is a different story. But, I think, so answering your question, I think in the Bharatiya's, context, there is definitely a particular space with which this Dharmic, frameworks can play an important role.
Got it. Quick question there. And then the gentleman behind her.
So I work in advertising, and I tend to agree with what you're saying because we see this in narratives. Indian economy functions on emotions when it comes to advertising. You look at our commercials, they're very different from the West because the West is very market leader driven and very factual. If you look at Korea, say, their whole thing is based on functionality, the narratives, or even the Chinese products, right? Whereas you look at our narratives, they pull the emotional string wherever possible, right? And it comes from the history that you're talking about. My question is, do you think this has any implication on the way South India is functioning so prosperously versus the rest of India? And does it have a link?
May I just request the second question also? Perhaps you can take them both together.
Thanks. So my question, I'll maybe illustrate with an example. You spoke about small enterprises and large enterprises and how probably both should operate within the realms of Dharma loosely. I'll take a practical example so that it makes it easier for everyone to follow. So let's say there's an online marketplace, e-commerce marketplace. They're large, they have wide distribution, etc. Now state steps in and says, you can no longer sort of sell products that you've made yourself, right? You've manufactured whatever, your own brand under the label. But that enterprise could argue that, hey, this is not dharmically right, because my dharma is to serve my customers at the best possible value, best possible price. But the state is stepping in and saying, no, you have to let smaller players also bloom. Therefore, you cannot do that, right? So where does dharma fit in this sort of maybe a more practical, if you can elaborate? That'll be great. Thanks.
Yeah.
So 2 points, the south and the north. And then
Yeah. So the south and the north, I'm not really sure. Probably 10 years later, you might have a different view. But I think, it could be, you're right in the sense that, advertising is a great sphere. I think from practical experience, you're saying, and I'm glad that, you're sharing this with us, because that's another area where I see distinct differences. So this is another example, right, of someone who's really in the practical world, whose business is driven by consumer choices, who's very well aware of how these consumer choices, affect their businesses, and they are aligned to some of the ideas that I'm talking about. So that is again an important construct. But how the southern and northern narrative is probably because of the educational gap. In terms of opportunities, I think inequality of opportunity is another huge, sort of. Correct. Correct. I agree. Yeah. Correct. So and see, remember, right? The South wasn't as affected by invasions and all the all the issues that the North face. Any other sort of civilization which has been ravaged like the North would be far more backward than what it is. So the context there is very different. You're right. And in the South, because of these factors, I think by nature you are at an advantage because of the fact that they are not affected by all this. And I think it's also sort of a holistic mindset, right? Their ability to sort of be inclusive, be engage the rest of the world. So I'll give you another example, right? There's a snippet in the book, so it'll trigger some of you to buy the book. So in the Pallavas, so there was a king, I don't know how many of you have been to the Kanchipuram Rajaraja Swami Perumal temple, which is an important temple. Okay, great. That's where the Uttarmeru inscriptions are somewhere nearby. But in that temple, in 7th century CE, around 732 CE, there was a king called Parameshwaran. So he didn't have a lineage. So he passed away. So the Pallavas were looking for someone else to take over the throne. And when they were looking, this king had a couple of generations before, a guy called Bhima, according to this lineage of this king, who had migrated all the way to Cambodia for trade and commerce, and he just migrated, right? So his family, kith and kin, were in Cambodia. So they had an extended person who was another king through this family lineage in Champa, Vietnam. His name was Hiranyavarman. So these Pallavas who were searching for this successor traveled all the way to Champa in Vietnam and went to this king. Okay. This king had 4 children. So first 3 children they offered the kingdom. None of them said they wanted, to come back to India, Bharat and all these things. They said no. The 4th kid was an 11-year-old guy called Nandivarman II. This Nandivarman said yes. He was titled Nandivarman. They brought this kid and anointed him as the king of the Pallava Empire. So he was the one who really expanded the Kanchipuram Rajaraja Swami Perumal temple, and he became one of the most popular or most heroic Pallava kings of his generation. So what I'm trying to say is, imagine the audacity, the sheer magnitude or the mental sort of aptitude of common people thousands of years back, where you accept someone who was born outside the country, like thousands of miles away, bring him, make him a king in such a powerful position, and also enable him to be one of the biggest rulers of his time.
suppose it highlights the benefits of thinking like an 11-year-old.
So that's probably also there. But what I'm trying to say is the societal construct is also, I think, an important factor for us to be cognizant about, because if this is what you define as a sort of a globalized outlook, there's no better approach to a globalized outlook. So what I'm trying to say is, probably the South had a leg up, definitely, so that could be one of the reasons. But I think eventually these gaps will start reducing as more and more of development happens.
Yeah.
On the next question, yes, I think that's a fair point, right? Because what is dharmic for an individual is very different to what is dharmic for the state, right? And I think, again, this subjectivity can be overcome if the state works on a set of first principles based on the idea of dharma, which is applied to the state, right? At an individual level, you can always argue, but at various individual constructs. But when you are making public policy, I think the state has to define what these first principles are, and everyone has to sort of come on board to those first principles. I think that's an iterative process the state has to sort of undergo. And that's where even Kautilya, he talks about the idea of avoiding Matsya Nyaya. So Matsya Nyaya is basically when you have, say, a big fish eating or a small fish, he wants to avoid, he says that implementation of rule of law and order is very important because it avoids this Matsya Nyaya. So when you implement rule of law and order in a very fair, transparent manner, then you take out the possibility of this big fish eating small fish and create a sort of a more equitable platform. That could also mean that you reduce the inequalities between the rich and the poor as well. That's why Kautilya had sort of advocated to, provide a lot of support for the real poor and things like that. So yeah, I think, this contradiction is something I acknowledge, but I think the state has to look beyond it and look at it through the prism of the state when it's advocating policy. But acknowledgement of this is important because it provides them an input while they're making policy.
And the point there is also, I think, if you look at examples in the book or even other examples you may have come across in even modern times, it's also the quality of moral leadership that goes up to those levels of running the state, right? Even there, in the end, there are individuals who are made up of certain moral values, and I think that's where this point comes in as well.
Just one more point is that in all of these texts, they don't argue against the rule of law and order. The rule of law and order is still central. But they say the idea of responsibilities is an important addition to the rule of law. So you have rules and regulations, you adhere to those rules and regulations, but besides that, there's another social element of responsibility-based approaches which provide an important addition to this, so that the rule of law and order is implemented properly. It's like dowry, right? For example, dowry was outlawed in this country in 1956, I think, 57. We all can agree that it still exists today, unfortunately, right? So I think this multi-dimensional approach to policy execution, rule implementation, taking along the society is something is what these things provide, some context.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of change tacks a little bit. A large part of the book looks at the implementation of these three principles that Sriram talked about across different civilizations. So the Pallavas, the Cholas, the Indus or Saraswati Sindhu civilization, and even Cambodia, which was quite an interesting chapter in itself. I want you to talk a little bit about the Dharmic ecosystem via temples, but in response to a question, right? Like I feel, even when we were talking earlier, you made a strong case for it. You made it earlier this morning as well. Couldn't there be better systems of or sort of more progressive systems of economic activity which a community can center around, which don't have some of the drawbacks of the temple economy model, largely, the caste hierarchies or the discrimination against certain groups. Why can't we just have malls all over the country, right? Like, just to make a point.
Right. So I'll deal with both your questions. So first, on the historical aspect. So what I find is that, not just in the southern kingdoms, there are various iterations of this model, right? So for example, the Cholas, most of their ports were in the coastal side of Tamil Nadu, right? So Nagapattinam, for example. Right? The Cholas viewed them as transient trade centers, which means something like Singapore. So Singapore, what does Singapore do basically, right? It's like a transient port which facilitates trade from rest of Asia into China and other parts of Southeast Asia, right? So the Cholas viewed this as a sort of a transient important destination for traders from Middle East all the way when they come to India, and then they go towards China through the Straits of Malacca route. Whereas on the other hand, the Pandyas saw trade because of their natural resources and their availability of all that as something more permanent, more between trading entities. They were trading a lot of products, and their ports were like sort of not these transient ones, but rather focused on their particular trade. So the extent of trade, for example, was significant in these kingdoms, right? Now they also had temple-based economies, but I wouldn't say ironically, but surprisingly enough, Cambodia had for many centuries, 8th century, at least minimum 6th century CE till about 13th century CE, the temple-based economic model. In fact, Kenneth Hall, who's one of the researchers who's done a lot of work on this, he argues on the temple-based economic model. From the various models that various researchers have done, which I showcase in the book, I tend to agree with him because when you go to Cambodia, you're just fascinated. I mean, I've been to villages in Cambodia. You will see, when you're walking in the villages, you'll see a Shivlinga somewhere on one side. You'll see another temple on some other side. And these are all non-functional temples, right? That's another point that I make. There's a difference between a non-functional temple and a functional temple, right? A functional temple it only gives you the ecosystem that I'm talking about as an output, the economic ecosystem. Yeah. Because if the temple is not functional, it's not taking care of its rites, rituals, and all these things, the economic ecosystem is not a byproduct. For example, today in Cambodia, the temple serves, or the Angkor Wat type of temple serves as major tourist destination. Okay, but all the other temples in the villages, they don't serve a purpose because there is no functionality of that institution, right? So, ironically enough, so Cambodia had a lot of these temple-based economies. You find that even in Vietnam. In fact, Foreign Minister Jaishankar was mentioning about a 7th century Shiva temple which ASI had discovered. Was part of Champa. In the coastline of Champa, for example, I show this in this book. You have cities called Panduranga. You have cities called Vijaya. These are all Indic names in all these places, and they used to communicate predominantly in Sanskritam, some of them in Tamil, some of them in regional languages. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of these models, surprisingly in Southeast Asia had a greater sort of temple-based economic models, had a central thrust to it. And of course, the Cholas, also had an important contribution and played an important role. So answering a question on your second question, right? So what I was discussing with him, or rather what I was telling him, is that if you want to name a single institution in a village today in India, in Bharat, which plays an important economic role, in my view, it is the temple. I'm viewing the temple purely through the economic prism, right? When I mean the economic prism, there are two things, right? One, the revenue that the temple itself generates because of the fact that you go into a temple, you have darshan, you pay money to have darshan and all that, right? That is a component. A lot of the discussion is around that component. But what I am arguing is that there is an ecosystem around the temple, which means there's a lot of shops around the temple, there is tourism because of the temple, there is, for example, Sringeri, right? I mean, in Karnataka, everything runs around the Sringeri institution. So what I'm trying to say is there is an economic ecosystem which is developed because of the temple in most of these villages, right? Right or wrong, that is how it is, right? So if you're looking at a decentralized economic model, where you're looking at expanding economies of scale in a decentralized level, logically speaking, you would want to liberate this ecosystem to be far more efficient, right? You would want to take the state away from this economic ecosystem that has been created because of the temple. Because, look, the temple and the state movement against the temple is a political issue, right? Fair enough. Ideally given to me, obviously I would want the state out of the temple, but that's a political issue. Let's not go there for now, right? But the ecosystem that this has generated is there for everyone to see. All these institutions that I'm talking about. That can be expanded in a strategic, in a careful bound way. And you have travel nowadays to many of the cities. For example, I can take a flight from Tiruchi to Delhi like twice a day, right? So you have access to a lot of these places. What I'm trying to say is you already have this system in place. So I'll give another example, right? Let's take the United States, for example, right? The US has a lot of these university towns, right? Like Urbana-Champaign, Cornell, Ithaca.
I was going to say that, yeah, that's the other alternative as well, right?
Right. So the US did this because they were at scratch, right? They didn't have anything else left. They had to build they had to expand some of these rural areas. They built educational institutions to their credit, right? Similarly, if you really think about it here, you already have all these places. You have these mammoth, temples for which thousands of people come, right? For a variety of reasons, right? We don't want to go into the religiosity of it for the sake of public policy, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that there's an inherent demand here for that particular place because of this entity. There's an economic demand right there. So to tap this, while I'd be very happy if you have all these Ivy League schools in all these places, but instead of waiting for 30 years, you might as well utilize what is there already there now, and then expand it over a period of time.
But from a policy perspective, right, I'm just going to stay with that a little bit more. Given the state of higher education in India, isn't that a lack of imagination that we don't want to go there? Like, what you just said about university towns, there's not a single state in the US where you don't have at least 3 or 4 big university towns which basically drive the entire ecosystem there. And couldn't that be imagined in India?
Definitely, but that imagination seems to be, going on for like almost 40, 50 years. So, it's time we start, either refining that imagination or look at alternatives which can, enable that imagination.
And what you said, that these are already there, right? Like
No, because this is what I'm trying to say, right? See, education is a noble construct. Okay? Education is something noble, right? We all want to be educated. We want all of them in this room and all kids, everyone to do a PhD and be, do really well, because that provides us opportunity, provides us everything, right? But the economic apparatus of a particular place is not necessarily defined by how these people have lived for a long period of time. See, unless you're sensitive towards it, it's difficult for you to sort of, take them on board. It's very important to have these education institutions, no doubt. I mean, we have to, probably in this strategic plan, you also take this along and see if some of this, villages and towns can be done. But when we already have an economic instrument which can be used, capitalized in a more coherent manner, because eventually you want economies of scale to improve, right? This again comes to the other discussion of urbanization, which we had. Probably I can just segue that into this, if you're okay.
I just have a quick point to add to that. And given the nature of India's society being as it is pluralistic, so I'm assuming that you extend this idea to mosques and churches as well, because growing up in Bombay, we've seen that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that is something you would want to also, bring into account while making policy choices.
Yeah, to your point about urban.
Yeah, so it's to this point again about urbanization, right? I again come back to the original point of this Western constructs that we're talking about. I mean, the Bangalore traffic is an example, right? I mean, I think we all can agree that we have come to a point in urbanization where it's reached a law of diminishing returns, right? For example, Chennai, where I'm born, where I come from, extends all the way till Kanchipuram now. And it extends all the way till Mahabalipuram. Okay? So it's a quasi nightmare living in cities, moving from one place to another cities. Still, people, throw the same doldrum of urbanization. How many people do you want to transport into urban cities, right? I think it's a very counterproductive conversation. I think we need to move ahead and think for other types of, developmental sort of paradigms. One of them is to empower tier 2, tier 3 cities. I think that is the focus. That's where the focus should be. And address this inequality of opportunity, right? Because essentially the opportunity is concentrated in the city, right? If I'm able to take opportunity and put it into tier 2, tier 3 cities, because mind you, we are having accessibility now improved much better in tier 2, tier 3 cities. Then I think it leads to a society which is far more, decentralized, right? And I think this sort of a decentralized approach is probably the way forward. And these type of methods sort of enable us to create clusters at these tier 2, tier 3 cities to expand the pie.
I'm going to just ask one more question, put you on the spot a little bit, and then open it up just for audience questions. Towards the end of the book, you allude to the fact that now you'll have a third book, which will be far more, I think, prescriptive, more solutions in it. And since you brought it up, what will be the Dharmanomics solution for Bangalore's traffic?
I don't know, probably, take all your IT guys and take them, move them 100 kilometers away and deal with mobility issues. But again, I mean, on a more, you asked on a lighter note, but on a more serious note, I think this also goes back to, policy makers who, years back, probably their objectives were different, their context was different, where they were sort of negligent of some of these issues that we're talking about, right? And some of the, and I think being sensitive to those needs is important, because unless you're not attuned to those local dynamics, both at the city level or at the village level, you're not going to get sustainable solutions, because sustainability, again, is a behavioral construct, right? This, for example, the PM's lifestyle movement that he talks about, which is sort of championed as a cause, is an important sort of initiative, because eventually, no matter what taxation you put through, no matter what the state tries to, thrust things on you, including, say, electric cars or whatever it is, eventually people need to be on board to buy these things. There needs to be a buy-in. They need to like the car. They need to be comfortable with it. So, and most of, sustainability related issues are all behavioral issues at the individual level. If you and I are sustainable and we make sustainable choices, it aggregates to a sustainable society. So I think these are some of the elements that...
The nudges idea again, perhaps in some way.
Correct. To sort of view this through a different policy construct, right? To be cognizant that there is an undercurrent that is happening, that has been happening for a long time. And you cannot wish away with this. You can't wish away this lifestyle, no matter what you want to, at least in the next 100 years. So might as well sort of, come to terms with it and have policy making which is aligned to it. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll start. Oh, wow. Okay. Start here and then move around. I think I'm going to go to someone else just because. Can we wait for it to close out? Yeah, Sabina. Mike, please. Yeah.
On what Vikram said about the caste hierarchies, and in Dharmanomics, especially in our context, in taking your example of the temple economy, definitely it takes a caste hierarchy to keep it going. If you look at, even when I go to my village and I talk to the sons and daughters of, let's say, the small scale producers, or everybody wants to escape their situation, and they're deeply capitalistic and ambitious. So is it a slightly romanticized nostalgia on our part to wish that this intergenerational kind of structure continues for them when they want to have that escape velocity and come to where we are? And also alluding to your example on the Pallava kings, we must remember that a lot of these kings exercise deeply autocratic power to gain that kind of just economy in the hierarchies below. And it's just an innocent question that I grapple with. Are we at the end of democracy, looking at what's happening, with Trump, with China, postures in our own country? Are we now alluding to an autocracy with concentrated power, which might be like a just king, and therefore we might have our rights protected by Dharmanomics?
Thanks. I'm going to just take 2 or 3 questions so that you can answer. Nazdeen, can you just come this way, please? Yeah, just so we spread it out.
Thanks for the conversation. One of the most important things, like within Dharma, was to decide who gets to do the Dharma Sthapana, right? And it feels like it's one thing to say that we need to localize Western sort of formal public policy efforts and localize them to our context. That's one thing. It's a completely other thing to say that because people have to do that Dharma Sthapana, we have to use Dharma as a core for public policy initiatives. Like, is there a difference? Can you tell us, without Dharma, how do you do Dharma Sthapana here?
Just the gentleman next to him, and then we'll pause for him to answer.
Yeah, this is about Dharmic viewpoint on taxation and subsidies. See, historically, in India, the agricultural income was taxed, which was the major source of revenue. 1/6 of the land revenue was taxed. But only during famines and other extreme situations it was exempted. But in the present day, we have a situation where the agricultural income is completely exempted and it is highly misused and becomes a vehicle for tax evasion. So from the Dharmic standpoint, do you think this is justified?
We'll let him answer and then.
Yeah.
So end of democracy,
Okay. So, yeah.
Dharma Stapna and the Dharma
yeah, so-
idea of taxation.
Thank you. So I will give a broad response. So on the role of caste. So for example, the Srenis that I talk about in the book, they again were a very important governance instrument. In the Srenis, you had people across various castes who were involved in commerce, and they were in leadership positions, which I highlighted with some examples. So I think there were institutions, even in those times, which highlighted the shortcomings or overcame the shortcomings that we are talking about in terms of discrimination. We all agree that, irrespective of caste, creed, opportunity, and everything should be fair and, square. And there were pockets of these institutions which had this egalitarian element, even in those times. The attempt here is not to romanticize the past. I am as much in agreement with you that there are a lot of issues of the past, right? The question really is, just because there are issues in the past does not mean that we shouldn't understand the past and gain elements which are practically applicable even today based on the past. So often for any sort of discussion on this subject, you often have this bogey saying that, okay, there is caste discrimination. Fine. So that doesn't mean that, you don't want to find any ways of how these guys were prosperous all these years. That does it sort of subsume the fact that the Cholas built some of the most marvelous architecture that you can even see today? So what I'm trying to say is, I think I am in agreement with you in that there are issues in the past which we need to deal with, and that's why one of the arguments here is to take what are the things that we can imbibe. It's not because that it's probably an answer to the next question, but it's not because that somehow Dharma is a sacrosanct concept and it is the sort of a paradigm that God created and that's how we need to follow. I'm not going in that realm. Okay, I'm trying to say that, look, there is a way of life that you're having today. It traces its origin to this time where you were considered to be one of the top countries in the world, not just by Bharatiyas, but people from across the world. So there had to be an element within this construct from which we can learn, of which Dharma is an important component. Because I'm not talking through the spiritual sort of element. I mean, I'm talking purely on the material, element of this. And on dictatorship, yeah, you'll probably be alive for the next 20, 30 years. I think you'll be witness to that. So, but yeah, I guess, yeah, we have our concerns, but things should be fine at some point. So on your question, sir.
On taxation.
So I think, so again, what I'm trying to say is, it is not a question of having a sort of a Dharmic approach because you're ordained to have a Dharmic approach. Is because if you want to make public policy effective, you have to correlate to the way of life. As long as the way of life is associated through a Dharmic based approach, a policymaker should be cognizant of this social fact. He or she cannot be just in their own cocoon thinking that somehow it is controversial to talk about this and just rub it under the carpet. Because if we do that, societal frictions will happen at some point of time because you're not able to assimilate to this construct. And in terms of the sort of Western norms, again, I would say that if you go to the first principles approach, we can bypass what the so-called Western norms are. In the sense, you understand, we try to engage with the principles of the West of how they conceptualize some of these things. If it's applicable for us, use it. If not, use our first principles and then do the evaluation.
That's an excellent point. And the taxation.
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's a very valid point. I mean, if Kautilya was alive today, the first thing I think he would do is tax agriculture. So
or land, yeah.
Yeah, and so that is definitely something, I think the political realities of today have made us in this spot. But I think in one thing in those times is that they had this sort of equal approach to policy, right? I mean, for example, you take taxation, most of them were taxed, except for some extraneous circumstances. So I think the way forward, or what some of these people would have done, is to probably tax.
Just a quick comment on that, just to add to what Sriram is saying. I think one of the answers also lies in what he alluded to earlier, this idea of decentralizing and a more federal structure where states have the power to tax what they want, as opposed to this centralized system of taxation.
No, just to add, right, on the decentralization, this is another point which is not at all part of the narrative, which should be part of the narrative. Because if you take even during Kautilya's time, he had, for example, in villages, people who get an assessment of the price points of products, right? Just to understand the entire pricing mechanism we're talking about today, right? The RBI and institutional mechanisms that we have. So Kautilya had people, for example, advocated for people to be at the ground level in villages to understand the changes in price points of products. So much of the ancient, I mean, if you look at some of these old photos, right, of Madras in the 1800s, Bangalore in the 1900s, they're all very pristine and beautiful, no? I mean, if you ask me, I would love to have modern cities like that. But it's not like these ancient kingdoms did not have cities. They did have cities. I mean, these places still existed during that time. But they were not obsessed with cities. They sort of believed in this sort of, the articulation might have been not as articulate as what we educated people want it to be. But the primary sort of argument was that most of it was sort of decentralized, so that there is a much more sort of wider.
It was more of a hub and spoke, right? Like, you had cities as the centers for trade and commerce, but people could live wherever they want.
Another thing is that, right, if you look at the West, if you look at the US, most of there's a city, the city is basically an area where it's a business district, right? Most of the businesses happen in the place. Most of the people live in the suburbs. And then there are rural areas, right? Even in the West, the form of urbanization was in this spirit. And somehow in our Asian societies, I don't know how we came into this model, but I think even in the Western model, they didn't probably copy it properly, I think. So, but anyways.
So next round of questions, I think just that lady there in the back. Keep your questions short, please.
Yeah, I've written it down. Thank you. Namaste. I'd like to go back to the temple as the center of economic ecosystems, but they weren't just that. Now there's a situation where the state says, okay, I'll withdraw my support from the temples and you take care of it, you run it. So when that happens, how will the Dharmic checks be implemented? How will these nudges be implemented? And also, the role of the temple itself has changed from back then to now. So will it be as robust as it was back then?
Okay. Right. Nazdeen, this gentleman here.
Thank you. Since it's named Dharmanomics and not, I was expecting few more kingdoms to be named, but I think Chola was the only one mentioned a couple of times. So my question is, can you attribute a time when Dharmanomics was maybe at its peak, or what time are we talking about? Is it 2 century BC, 3 century BC, or was it until the Mughals and the first 10 centuries of the first millennia? So the time, and can you also attribute parts of India to it, like a place? Where was it active, like northern India, southern India? That is one question. And second question is that, can we boil down the tenets of this Dharmic and economic philosophy to some small, something that is written by someone, or I know it might not be possible, but then if we have to implement it, we will need to boil it down to few things, right? We can't be vague and very, including everything. We can't be, we need to fix it.
That's why he's writing his books.
Yeah.
So let's go back there to that gentleman. I'm sorry, we're just going to take 4 questions and then we'll have to wait for one more round here.
Yeah, one is an observation and one is a question. I'll be very brief. The observation is that with quick commerce coming in, right? But intrinsically, in a lot of our household, our mothers and even us, we feel that we should support the Kirana store. So that's a place where I think Dharmanomics, plays a role in all our lives. The second thing is that, Rajgopalachari in the early 50s tried to implement some model of Dharmanomics in Tamil Nadu, which badly backfired. So what's the problem with implementation there? So that's my question.
Okay, and this gentleman in the front is last question for now, and then we'll.
Why are we so corrupt?
Thank you. Great question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, right. So yeah, let me start off with you. So, I don't have an answer, sir. So I think, but let me throw a more serious observation, right? 50 years back or 60 years back, were we this corrupt? I think that's okay. So that's no okay. So that's I think that is probably an important question to ask. If corruption became a menace now, or it's been always there. But to answer your question, I don't really have an answer. So I will go to the question that the lady had. So on the nature of the temple, right? So I talk about the multi-dimensional nature of the temple in detail in the book. So, but in very simple terms, it served multiple purposes. One, it is a labor aggregator, which means a lot of the employment in the villages were all aligned to, because the temple owned large sections of land as well. So in terms of that sort of labor aggregation played an important role. Second, a very important role, it was a financial institution. See, there's a reason why, if you look at all the major temples, especially in southern India, they're all within an hour's drive, hour and a half drive from the coast. Except for Madurai Meenakshi Amman temple, most of the major temples, if you see, whether it's the Padmanabha Swami temple, whether it is even, Somnath, you would see that a lot of them are near the coastal areas. There's a reason for this. Because most of the financing of all these guilds that I talk about were all done through the temple as a financial institution. So this temple would, for example, give out loans to these guilds and to these, corporate guilds at a particular interest rate. And they would take financing from some of these institutions and then, have commerce, trade. And they had wide range of agreements, profit sharing agreements you talk about today. There were profit sharing agreements between the temple, the guild, and other sort of traders who were having, trade. So, and they also played an important role like a VC fund, for example. A lot of these local traders or local communities used to use the temple as sort of a financing instrument, where once a certain credibility is established, when these financial institutions were not there, it served as a financial institution to give them, right? So it served as an important financial institution, as a bank, as a sort of an entrepreneurial sort of, hub. And most importantly, it served as a redistributive function, right? We all talk about inequality here, right? Inequality is what? Basically the gap between the rich and the poor, right? In very, very simple terms, right? There is evidence in the Tirupati Tirumala plates which talk about in the Vijayanagara Empire, specifically in Vijayanagara Empire, where this was institutionalized, where it happened in other places as well, in the Cholas as well, but this here is more institutionalized, where a bunch of rich people in a particular area would put money and financing into an endowment fund. This endowment fund would govern and would provide all the input for the temple to function, right? And the temple will take care of its own sort of religious identities and whatever the rituals that need to be done, all the samskaras will be taken care. And they will give 3 times a day free food for whoever is coming to the temple, right? In essence, what it did was, for the real poor, it provided them food for 3 times a day, free of cost, right? And it ensured that the rich, whatever money that they had, they put it into an endowment fund. So it was, in a sense, sort of a transfer between the rich and the poor, and in a way to sort of ensure that the real poor were given basic amenities, during the day. So these are ideas that the temple, the multidimensionality of the temple as an institution, it would still exist today. So what I'm trying to say is that the temple viewed as through the religious, social, ritualistic samskara samskara frame is very important. That's its central functionality. But there's an economic, after effect of it. So answering your first question on the, if they are removed from the state and things like that, I think eventually people will also, find a way through that. I mean, at some point, it's not like, we are democratic or we have democratic institutions only now. I mean, Uttarameru inscriptions tell you how political process was democratic even during those times. So I think we will eventually find a way through that.
To Rajaji's.
Rajaji's question. So thanks. So yeah, that's a very valid point. I mean, on the Kirana shops, right? Even today, for example, my grandmother, I mean, she's no more now, but a few years back, she used to tell me that despite all these things, the same person who used to come and give us milk for the last 30 years, she'll still go and get the milk from them, irrespective of cost. So that is how relationships are built, and that's how it affects economic choices. That is the reality. And on Rajaji, I haven't really, now that you've told me this, I'll go back and look at what was done in more detail. So thanks for that observation. But it could also be the context and time, right? I mean, we are talking about 1950s when India was still considered extremely poor. We were told that we were snake charmers, and we were sort of looking down upon whatever that was in our past. Now the dynamic is different. Right? In the next 15, 20 years, I think there'll be a paradigm change where all these things will be re-looked at and repositioned into not just a Bharatiya way of existence, but also some lessons for the rest of the world to live. I mean, take International Yoga Day, right? I mean, I've been abroad for about 10, 15 years. 10 years back, I mean, no one really, yoga used to be, obviously a lot of people know about yoga, but in the echelons of power, yoga was seen as something which is distinct. But today, International Yoga Day, every foreign leader in the world is doing yoga. So this is because not just because we have a very sort of globally respected leader. That's one part of it. But the bigger story is the Indian story is being seen as the global story. It is seen as the global driver. And that is not is not restricted to any government. It's going to be the trend, I would say, another 15, 20, 30 years or whatever beyond. So that's when I think, so if Rajaji had positioned his ideas probably now, I think that might be much greater traction.
And then was there a peak in one of the civilizations?
Yeah, so in this book, basically I deal with, I don't deal with the pre-Chola era. Okay, that again goes into historiography and things like that. I mean, I have my own views, but I didn't, specifically in this book, what I deal with is the common era kingdoms, right? So most of the peak of what I see is between, say, 5th or 6th century CE till about, I would say, if I take Vijayanagara also included almost 16th, 17th century CE. But the real peak, I would say, is between 6th to 13th, 14th century CE, which includes all of Southeast Asia. As well. See, another important thing is to understand that all these things happen simultaneously. Okay, I have shown evidences or interactions between Suryavarman II, who built the Angkor Wat temple, and the Chola kings, where, for example, he had given a gift which has been kept in the Chidambaram temple as well. And the Cholas, and once the Cholas built the Brihadisvara temple, the Cambodians learned lessons from that temple and used it in building the Angkor Wat, which is built about 100 years later. So there are a lot of these interactions between these people, and you also see that's why the anecdotal evidence is very important, right? Because you see external entities away from the region. I'm talking about Greeks, Romans, and all their travelogues and all their, they all reinforce this point that this place was sort of a global leader during this time, right? It's not like these guys are themselves saying that they're global leaders, right? There are, other anecdotal evidences which say that they had something which was uniquely, sort of central of the global attention. And that's important to understand because that shows that you had a certain skill set, a certain paradigm of functioning, living, both at the economic, socio-economic sphere, which was a standout in the world at that point of time, right? And that's what, this tries to sort of elucidate in that context.
Got it. We're out of time, but I'll take one last question, and the gentleman in the front, and then give you the closing word.
Yeah, in today's context, the king is, of course, the government, central government, state government, local governments, etc. So the trade-offs, dharmic principles that you're talking about, trade-offs required in today's context really are the large corporate versus the small and mid-sized corporates versus the enterprise, entrepreneurship that is needed to bring up the economy and so on, number one. Number two, I think at the individual level, actually ability to be able to get a job, skill set, education, etc., the principles that need to be followed. So to what extent today are these dharmic principles already incorporated, supposed to be incorporated in the constitution and all the policies of the economic policies of the government of India or state governments and so on? To what extent is it there, and to what extent is needed to be developed further?
Right.
Is it the question of principles, or is it the question of implementation?
Right. Very good question. So I will get your first point first, just make an observation. See, even though there are monarchies in all these places, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that the king ruled everything, right? For example, the Srenis, the corporate guilds, they were completely independent. They had no interference from the state. The king, for example, had a lot of property for himself, yes, but not all property was related to the king. There are a lot of private entities. There are a lot of other entities. So the king or the monarch, especially in some of these kingdoms, was seen as a supervisory role more than a sort of a dictatorial role, right? So that is one mild observation. On your point, that's a very valid point. You see, inbuilt, there are already a lot of these things which are there without being explicitly said in policy making, right? So some of these changes that I mentioned, right, like Swachh Bharat, for example, or this RBI initiative, or there are a lot of these things where people, we call them jugaad in some sense, we give them different nominations. And in some cases, you just do it because that's how things get done. But why it is important to extract this as an institutional prerogative or a formalized sort of way of life is important, because that's when you'll be conscious about this at the individual, at the policy level. Because unless you create an awareness of it, you won't make a systemic effort to see if there are ways with which you can make these things effective more. If not, it'll be just ad hoc, there are a lot of ad hoc interventions now happening. But I think that has to be in a more a systemic manner, so that you get a greater buy-in on policy initiatives. Because eventually you want, when you're a policy maker who's trying to implement policy, you want not just the stakeholders, the business stakeholders and all these guys on board, you also want the people on board to consume and to be on board with your ideas. So for example, in the United States, the idea of electric cars is an example, right? In the sense, because of the push on climate change and all these things, everything is becoming electric. But a lot of people are preferring hybrid cars because that's their comfort zone, right? You can't just impose it. So what I'm trying to say is, in our context, I think the conscious awareness of this will take us into a far more systematic way of approaching this. Because irrespective of it, what I'm trying to say is, another problem is that eventually the Babu who's sitting in Delhi or the bureaucrat who's sitting in some of these places is going to decide policy, in the sense how construction of policy and things like that, right? That individual's exposure to all these things would be, not necessarily, you don't know how much exposure he will know all these things, right? Unless you systemize this, bring it into a public forum, have a discussions, debate, then you create awareness among all these people. Then they'll be cognizant of it while, making some of these efforts.
Also, these institutions are actually additional dimensions that need to be considered.
Correct.
It could be regulators, it could be other institutions which are not necessarily the king alone, as you said. It's actually the whole thing. Correct.
Last point is that, see, it can be applied. For example, let's take the IBC, right? The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, okay, which was recently initiated 2016-17. In my previous book on Kautilyanomics, I show how the Samadana Bandha Ved principle of Kautilya was one of the sort of pillars of that institution, because that's how it sort of functions. And some of the iterations that they've made are based on some of these ideas. So there are practical elements that are there already in our systems, where we iterate based on these sort of lifestyle choices, and that is something that if you explicitly bring it about, then it makes a mental shift, right, in how you approach these things, and then it becomes sort of an autopilot for you to do it.
Suppose that's a great note to end on. And to your point, I think it's important for us to reflect how many of these principles are already in our constitution and were put into place at that time.
And
Yeah.
I just want to thank all of you, because generally the Bangalore crowd is amazing. I mean, on a Sunday, you've come, and more importantly, such engaging questions. I have,
Yeah.
I really appreciate, your
Thank you.
interaction.
And thank you for being here, Sriram. Thank you all. Sriram will be signing books. So please pick up a copy. And thank you all for being here.